This is just a that we're going to wait a minute or two more to let more people join, and then we're going to get going. It's now 12:02, so we might as well get going. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar being hosted by the American Marketing Association of New York, with audio provided by the Dobbs Ferry Police Department. Today, we're going to be discussing the second installment of the Future of Marketing study. The first dealt with techlash. In particular, we looked at the impact of marketing technology and showed how it compared with that of our study 2 years ago. In particular, we found that while people had increased their use of MarTech considerably since the pandemic, more aware of its positives, but still were quite aware of its negatives too. If you're curious about that, you can look at the AMA New York website. Today, though, we're talking about purpose. It's a subject that a lot of companies and a lot of consumers have been thinking about in the last couple of years. But from the viewpoint of the marketer, there are a couple of key questions that we need to look at. One is, how seriously are both marketers and consumers taking it? The second is, how do you actually do it? What does it mean? So today we have a very strong panel to tell us about that. And the other members of the panel are Joanna Seddon and Sarah Colamarino. And I'll tell you a little bit about them now. Sarah was formerly Vice President of Corporate Brand for Johnson & Johnson, climaxing a 30-year career rising through the ranks there. She was focused on building a unifying brand purpose across the global enterprise as the basis for transforming that familiar J&J brand from consumer products to a broader healthcare leader and innovator, not just Band-Aids, in other words. And central to what she did was building brand strategies all across the firm, working with human resources, DE&I, corporate citizenship, and sustainability, as well as various brands across the company. She's now a consultant on building and activating brand purpose and works closely with the Prescient Consultancy as their healthcare brand strategist. Second, we have Joanna Seddon. Joanna is managing partner at Prescient, which is a brand consulting company that she started just over a year ago. Before that, she's been a serial starter of brand consultancies, including Future Brand, Kantar Consulting, and most recently Ogilvy, where she created and built a global brand consulting business from scratch, very successfully over the past 10 years. Joanna is an expert on the strategic aspects of branding, creating new brands, reigniting old ones, or working with brands in M&A or IPO transactions. Purpose is at the center of all her brand work. I should also add, by the way, that she is on the AMA board and is a past president of the AMA New York, as well as one of the founders of the Marketing Hall of Fame. And how about me? Joanna and I actually overlapped as graduate students at Oxford about 25 years ago. We lived around the corner from each other, but we didn't meet each other until about 10 years ago. Anyway, I am CEO of Charney Research, a boutique market and strategy research company operating in New York for about 25 years this month. We focus on global markets. We've worked in over 50, including, of course, the US. Our work has a number of focuses. One has been tech, including MarTech, which we looked at in part one of Future of Marketing, as well as healthcare and international development. We've worked extensively on purpose and social responsibility, most recently on gender in the workforce for Business for Social Responsibility and sustainability issues for the leading builders of America. Now, as you know, we've done a major survey on the question of purpose, where we spoke to both consumers and marketers across the US. But before we present those results, I want to turn to Joanna, who can tell us a little bit of the background to the company. She was one of the folks who was involved with actually making purpose something important for the corporate world. So Joanna, unmute and take it away.
Okay, so I only really realised this recently, and I think many people know, is that the current, fame of the idea of purpose, um, where it came from. Now, it's always been there with some companies. If you look back to the 1840s, Cadbury, the British chocolate factory company, had built model villages for its workers, which in the 1840s even gave them swimming pools and billiard tables and educated their children. But it wasn't how the corporate world thought. It was about profits. Profits first, and that accentuated in the 80s with the idea of, it's all about shareholder value. Um, and it's changed. But the current change really goes back to work that I led a team on when I was actually at what became Kantar Consulting, Millwall Brown Optimore, um, working with Procter and Gamble. And there were two people whom you may have heard actually leading the charge at P&G. There was Jim Stengel, who was Chief Marketing Officer, and Mark Pritchard, who was like his sort of chief number two. Um, and it was their idea. They came to us with a question. It was a big consulting pitch, 11 companies pitched. Um, and the question was, which brands have grown the value the most over the last 5 years? Any brand anywhere in the world, define brand how you like. And how did they do it? What was it they did that made them so successful? Which must be, it's a fantastic set of questions. We won the Bake Off with McKinsey to win it. We should have, because we know more about brand than they do, I think. But anyway, and then we did a seminal study, which really answered the question of how is, what drives the success of companies from their brand point of view. What makes a company the best at building value through brand? And the answer was, these companies are driven by purpose. We actually had a whole pyramid, had purpose at the top. Beyond that came some of the pillars which create purpose. Then how they organize themselves internally, the place that brand and purpose play in the organization, how they structure the whole experience, and then how they take it to market throughout communications. So it was like a template, but it was driven by purpose. And it transformed the nature of marketing. They took it very seriously. And because we had linked it to financials, we'd shown that the brands which followed these principles and were driven by a purpose made more money than other brands, significantly more money than other brands. And that got, this P&G may be about consumer packaged goods, but I'll tell you, when I presented to, a room of it was the 400 top people at P&G. They have this convention every year in a bunker in Cincinnati. When I presented to them, most of the people in that room are not marketers. They're finance guys, they run manufacturing. They're absolutely not marketers. And they listened. Why? Because one of the chief financial people introduced it and said, look, you can believe this stuff because it makes money. I've seen the numbers. Yeah. So that is one of the key things that makes this whole debate so important, and why P&G changed. They elevated the name of it, no more CMOs, Chief Brand Officer, and under brand went many more things. So the whole organization changed the way they thought, changed the way they did all their branding and marketing. And then when Jim Stengel left P&G sometime later, he said, I want to take this idea with me. And P&G said, well, it's ours. And he said, well, please. And they're very fond of Jim. And so they said, Jim, yes, if you change the methodology a little bit. And you have to do another study to prove it and change the methodology. So he did. But he was lucky enough, or we were lucky enough, to be able to support him again. So I and my team, in doing all the work, the research that lay behind it, which turned into, actually dug it out to show you, Grow, which was the first book really on purpose, which was the outcome of all of that. So Jim went out into the world because what he wanted to do when he left P&G was to take a global pulpit and explain to everybody and try and rally marketers behind the idea of purpose. So that is where it came from. I think one of the key takeaways is that this is important. This is about business, especially today, and more so every year. Companies that follow purpose make more money. They're more successful. They're more successful in every way. So that I'll hand over to you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And just a little bit on ground rules here. We'll be taking questions in the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask questions either when we are speaking or at the end of the two sections. This presentation will call specifically for questions, and we'll try to respond to them as best we can. The first half will focus on the results of the survey. The second half, some of the takeaways and the implications for marketers and companies in terms of how they actually go about pursuing purpose. So to begin with, though, I will start some screen sharing, and I will present a few slides on the purpose survey. And let's see. Oops, excuse me just a moment. There we go. Okay, and then out of slideshow. Yes, there we are. Okay, so these are the results of the AMA study on the future of marketing. The survey was fielded last year. We interviewed online about 500 American consumers and 415 American marketers. This was done courtesy of our friends at Toluna, who did a terrific job, both of fielding the study and of completing the data. And we are very grateful for their help. And what we found was that comparing the attitudes of consumers and marketers was particularly helpful in terms of understanding just how much of an impact purpose is making on the marketing field. So let's take a look at some of the results. First off, we asked consumers, what issues should companies be addressing? What are your top two? And we asked marketers, what issues are your companies actually addressing? The long blue bars are the marketers' responses. The slightly shorter green bars are the consumers. Now, what's interesting about the consumer responses is that there are four top ones. Two of them have to do with the company itself, that it's a good employer, that it gives people fair pay, that it engages in fair labor practice and so forth. The other had to do with the company in the community, corporate citizenship, giving back to the place where you operate and to your customers. Then there were two other key factors, which were racial equality and sustainability. And these quite clearly relate to the issues that have really been boiling in our society over the last couple of years. Had we done this in, say, 2019, I think they would have come out a bit lower, especially racial equality. After that came a number of other purposes that companies have mentioned: protecting voting rights and democracy, women's rights, DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, criminal justice reform, and LGBTQ plus issues. Now, another thing that's striking, as you can see from the chart, is that companies are largely responding. If we look at the top issues companies are focused on, two of them are two of the key issues. The top two are the two key issues for consumers, namely being a good employer and corporate citizenship. After that comes a challenge directed to companies, namely DE&I in the workplace and sustainability. And the next issue after that is racial equality. In other words, what we're seeing from the study is not only that consumers are responding, and responding both as consumers and as members of the society, but also that companies are hearing them and they are responding on many of the same issues as well. Now, we saw some interesting differences among them. Here in this chart, you see the top four priorities of consumers in each of the four major generations now in the marketplace: Gen Z, the under 25s, the millennials, 26 to 40, the Gen Xers, 41 to 55, and the boomers like me who are over 55. And we see some interesting differences between them. Gen Z, interestingly enough, who are the newest to the workplace, do not include immediate company issues among their top 4 concerns. They're the only generation that does not mention a good employer or corporate citizenship among its highest priorities. Rather, number 1 is racial equality, which is not so surprising when you remember not only have we gone through the post-George Floyd traumas, but also the fact is that the majority of Generation Z is not white. After that comes sustainability, which is another concern for a generation that probably has the longest time frame in mind of any of the generations now in the workplace. Next comes DEI. Makes sense, again, given the diversity of the generation. And interestingly enough, it's also the only group to put women's rights in its top 4 priorities. And here we see, I think, another aspect of the openness of Gen Z to social change. Now, the other 3 generations, all their elders have being a good employer and corporate citizenship in their top 3 priorities. These are the generations, after all, that are more involved in the workplace today. The millennials are close to Gen Z. After those 2, they mentioned sustainability and then racial equality. Their slightly older group, Gen X, have the same priorities, but in a slightly different mix. Enough, they are the ones who do not, despite their youthful liberalism, mention racial equality as one of their priorities. They do have employment and sustainability. Interestingly enough as well, they are the only ones who mention democracy as a priority, which is a bit of a surprise. So we see that while there are broad trends which have some applicability to all generations, there are important differences by generation as well. How about race and ethnicity? Well, here we see the top 4 priorities for white, Black, and Latino consumers. Again, they have a lot of similarity to the overall trend. In particular, being a good employer and a good corporate citizen is part of the top 4 demands of all 3. But after that, they diverge a bit. Whites put sustainability and racial equality at place 3 and place 4 on this list. On the other hand, for minorities, for Blacks and Latinos, racial equality is the most important task that they think companies should be addressing in the social sphere. Blacks put right after that DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. On the other hand, among Latinos, sustainability and, interestingly enough, women's rights also come into the top 4. So again, we see some differences, not just by generation, but also by racial and ethnic background. Now here we look in a little more detail at the question of corporate support for democracy, which became a major issue in the context of the 2020 election. Excuse me. We see that it is lowest, interestingly enough, among Zoomers, Gen Z, despite the fact that they are also considered the most liberal of the generations, and that it is highest, as I just mentioned, among boomers. We also see that when it comes to companies getting involved with democracy, there's an important difference by size. For small and medium-sized firms, those with under 500 employees, only about a quarter of the companies are involved in trying to promote voting by their employees or democracy more generally. On the other hand, for larger firms, those with more than 500 employees, 40% are. What we seem to see here is the fact that companies that are less dependent on specific local markets and more dependent on a national market are freer to operate in this space. It's also something that we saw in terms of the patterns by market, by sector as well, where retailers were the most reluctant to get involved in this area, no doubt considering it a potential hot potato, which could be divisive among their consumers, while on the other hand, IT and producer goods firms were the likeliest to, both being less affected by the direct consumer market and themselves likely to have more liberal employees. Now, one thing we looked at was the question of whether or not all this purpose actually has anything to do with purchase. As Joanna said, there's already evidence that suggests that it does matter to companies, and it does matter to the bottom line. Here we see more evidence along those lines. Now, overall, we saw the majority of consumers saying they are more likely to buy from firms that have a purchase. That number was actually about 80%. But about half of them said they were also willing, much more likely to do so from companies that are purpose-driven. Here, though, we saw the big dividing factor was income. People at the bottom of the scale, those with incomes under $25,000 a year, which would put them in poverty, are the least likely to do so. 15% say this. However, among those at the top end of the scale, those in the top quintile, 125,000 a year or more, the majority, 51%, say they're much likely to buy from purpose companies. In other words, they can afford to and they feel a need to. There's a correlation, obviously, between education and income. In between, we see that there's a directly proportionate relationship between income and willingness to buy for purpose. Now, for marketers, we saw an interesting difference by company growth rate. In particular, what we see is that the slower growing companies are the ones who are more likely to, the slower growing companies are less likely to emphasize purpose, while the companies with faster growth rates are more likely to do so. Again, underlining the point Joanna was making. Thus, for example, we see that companies that have the slowest growth, 0 to 10% or even negative growth, 37% of them say consumers are much more likely to buy from companies who are purpose-driven. From those in the middling range, 11 to 15% growth, 41% say that. But of those who are experiencing the fastest growth, 15% plus per year, fully 2/3 say their consumers are more likely to buy from them if they are purpose-driven. In other words, purpose seems to be associated with purchase intentions by consumers and with corporate growth as well. Now here we see the willingness to buy more, willingness to pay more by income and generation, because consumers not only say they're more willing to buy from firms that display purpose, they're also more willing to pay higher prices for products. As we can see, that too is income related. In the case of the lowest income consumers, they are the least likely to be willing to pay more. But, the majority of those in the third and fourth quintiles, and 2/3 of those in the top quintile, in other words, most of those from 80,000 a year up, are willing to pay more. By generation, interestingly enough, we see an inverse relationship. We see that the Zoomers, Generation Z, is the likeliest to be willing to pay more, followed by the millennials at 63%. On the other hand, among Gen X, only 50% say they're willing to pay more. And among the oldest group of consumers, the boomers, only 1 in 4 say they're willing to pay more for products from companies with purpose. Finally, here we see marketer perceptions of willingness to pay more. And in this case, a substantial amount, 10% plus or more. As we can see by industry, it also is weakest among retailers and strongest among consumer service providers. Now, this partly may reflect the fact that lawyers, dentists, and doctors tend not to be chosen on the basis of price. But in any case, what it does indicate is that among consumer non-durables and consumer services in particular, there's a good deal of immunity. But even in all the other subsectors, there is a substantial proportion who think their consumers would pay more. And here we have by company growth rate. And again, those who are growing at less than 10% a year are the least likely to say their consumers are willing to pay more. Only 1/3 will do that. Of those who are growing at 10 to 15% a year, half will. And of those who are growing at more than 15% a year, well, fully 57% of their consumers and purchasers say they are willing to pay. Fully 57% expect that their consumers and purchasers are willing to pay at least 10% more. So that represents a fairly rapid summary of the findings. If you're interested in getting more detail on them, take a look at the address we have right at the top here, amanewyork.org, landing, download, Future of Marketing Purpose. And you can find a direct connection to that on amanewyork.org, our landing page. So I'll stop the sharing now, but let's have a discussion of the findings. First off, if anyone has questions, obviously, please feel free to ask. One question that's been asked already in the chat is, how is purpose being defined for this conversation? Currently, it is a very broad umbrella term. And partly the reason why we've left it in the survey to be that way is in order to allow to people to respond to it in the broadest possible sense. But I wonder if Joanna or Sarah, if you would like to add some comments on what we mean by purpose there.
I can have a start and then let Sarah chime in. I think
Okay.
purpose is as I think I mentioned earlier, traditionally companies have stood for profit. That was their job. Return value to shareholders. That's what we're here for. It's about having another goal besides profit, which is standing for something which is about doing good, doing what's right. So that is the line of big sense of purpose. um, when developing or trying to identify and uncover purposes with companies and brands, what we usually say is purposes answers the question, why do we exist? Is the answer we exist to make money? Is the answer we exist to make all the world's information available for free to everyone? Which is a little different from making money. That's Google's purpose. It's actually democracy, right? Opening up, democratizing information and making it available to all. So it's having a bigger idea than just profits.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I agree with that. I often like to think of the word ambition. What do you stand for? What's your ambition in the world? And I think that's an important distinction. I came from a company that one could always said was purpose led. And yes, it was. I think, though, in today's terms, it was more values led. But what was always missing was, what do we all collaboratively stand for? And informing that purpose, that ambition, that serves to unify and empower organizations.
Yeah, and I think the important thing about the idea of purpose is that it is not the same thing as corporate citizenship or corporate sustainability. It is bigger.
Yes.
It is what do we want to stand for, as Sarah said? How do we want to make the world better? What are we offering as benefits to society at large? And under that, you can put benefits to employees, you can put benefits to shareholders, you can put corporate sustainability, you can put, treating your workers well, DEI, all the rest of it, but they are second. They are supporting pillars of purpose. Purpose is the idea that we're going to do what's right.
Yes.
And I always like to think of a circle, right? That if you do what's right and you earn for the business, then you're able to reinvest in society. And as society gets stronger, businesses get stronger. And I think that's the whole concept of stakeholder capitalism today.
Yes. I mean, I think one of the interesting aspects of purpose, as Joanna was just saying, is that it can involve either and or what the company does, that is to say, works in healthcare, does surveys, etc., or how the company does it, how it treats its employees, how it relates to the community, what have you. Those are not either ors by any means. Both of those can come together to answer the question, what is the purpose of this company, as opposed to just, is this company making money? Although there obviously, as we're suggesting, a relationship between the two. I think, let's see, another interesting question we got is, or sorry, this is, I think for, sorry, I'm just trying to get this. Oh, yes. The current Harvard Business Review has an article on what is the purpose of your purpose that distinguishes between three meanings of purpose: competence, culture, and cause. Most of the discussion of purpose default to thinking that purpose is synonymous with cause. Joanna or Sarah, any thoughts on that?
Do you want to go first, Sarah, since I did last time?
Yeah. I would answer that in that I really do think that you've got to think about the purpose as really a unifier across the company. I think that sometimes we forget that as a management tool, one of the most powerful things any CEO can do is unify and motivate and ignite their organization. And I think of purpose starting there. And then I believe once that's accomplished, then the rest can all fall into place. But I look at purpose as a powerful management tool.
Well, and I think that oh, hi, Jonathan, by the way. I think that this Harvard Business Review thing about three meanings of purpose, competence, culture, and cause, those are not really definitions of purpose. What they are is ways in which purpose can be built, which is different. It is not what purpose is, it's how you create it. So nothing wrong with them, but they are. And absolutely, there's a lot of, people want to talk about cause, but in fact, if you look, you'll see that it's not just about cause. And in fact, people don't think about it cause, but look at the importance. Your number one factor, Craig, was being a good employer.
Yes.
That's not really a cause, that's behaving well,
Yeah.
treating people right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm struck by the three components that Jonathan mentioned. I think they are all part of it. Competence is clearly there. I mean, if you say your corporate brand purpose is to go beyond petroleum and you flood the Gulf of Mexico with oil, there's some question about your competence. Likewise, in culture, if you have a chief executive who's known as Chainsaw Jack, that's not that likely to produce a unified corporation where people all feel like they're pulling in the same direction. But causes are important too. And as I mentioned, they can be related either to what the company does or how it does it. And Jonathan makes the comment that he likes the idea that the role of purpose is to unify around a common goal, not just a social goal. And Nikhil, and hello there, Nikhil, says, what are best practices ensuring that all employees are aligned to and embrace the purpose? So Sarah, do you want to take a whack at
Yeah,
that?
yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I think I have always used the role of co-creation. I don't think that a purpose is created in isolation. I think that a purpose has to reflect the organization, its values, its people. And I really believe that if you can get a core group of present and future leaders to help co-create that purpose, they become the ambassadors. And it's almost like you're creating a snowball effect. So they enroll their people, they enroll their communities. And before you know it, purpose can be driven from the bottom down and from the bottom up. And I think that's a really important scenario. And I think that is the key to engagement. It's co-creation, it's ownership, it's ambassadors, it's people who believe in the work and help to convert the rest of the organization along with the management team.
Yeah, Glenn, want to add anything?
Yeah, I think you know, one of my favorite experiences ever doing branding was working with MD Anderson, the cancer hospital. Now, their purpose is to make cancer history, but it's all about driving it down to the employees, which may mean only hiring people who fit with the culture and the purpose. Having a purpose may mean getting rid of people who don't fit with the purpose. It definitely will. People don't behave with the purpose. But once you succeed, it can have the most incredible effect and people stay. It actually, not just may get consumers to pay more for goods, which sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. They usually don't think they are. But it can also attract employees, help win the talent war, and get people to stay. So getting back to MD Anderson, I was talking to the guy who was the CEO, and he told this story about how he'd been working very late in the hospital one night, and when he came to leave, the only person in the lobby was the janitor sweeping up. And so he got to talk to him, and he said, he asked him, he discovered he'd been a janitor at the hospital for 10 years. And he said, what made you stay? It's not such a glorious job. And he said, I feel that now when I'm here, I know I am doing my bit to making a real contribution to making cancer history. That's a purpose-driven company. Yeah. When your janitor stays because he agrees with the purpose. But that's what you have to try and achieve. Hire people who fit with it, explain it to people, really live it so that they believe in it internally. Because if you don't believe it internally, nobody's going to believe it externally.
And if you don't have actions that match what you say, your employees can't believe what you're saying. They've got to feel and experience the purpose themselves.
Yeah, I think those are very helpful comments. I want to pick up on something Joanna said, because one of the findings of the survey pointed to the idea that people will pay and pay significantly more for products with purpose. I'm wondering if, Joanna, you and Sarah think they're just saying that, or if you in fact think that it's really true.
Well, I think mostly they're just saying it.
Mhm.
Um, but in fact, because when they are paying more, that's not how they think about it. They don't think I'm paying more because the company has a purpose. You know, people may say they would like to pay more, but when it comes to the choice, they very often don't. But if you think about it's because they view the company differently and they think about the experience differently. I mean, a very easy example is Starbucks. Now, I was actually, I'm a bit shell shocked because I came back from Switzerland yesterday. Um, and the price of a Starbucks in Zurich is 7 Swiss francs, which is about $9. Can you believe it? You thought it was bad here at 5 or 6 or whatever it is, yeah? Um, so why do people pay, you know, up to $9 for a cup of coffee, which, frankly, if you're a coffee aficionado, may not actually be the best coffee. It may be a very sugary drink with lots of stuff in it. Um, why? It's because the idea that drove Howard Schultz with Starbucks wasn't making cups of coffee. It wasn't selling overpriced sweet cups of coffee. It was making human connections. So the idea is there's a third place, home, work, and Starbucks, where people really connect and communicate. And that's why people pay more. So, but people don't put it like that. So they're not going to Starbucks so much for a cup of coffee always, as to because Starbucks stands for this whole idea of connections, and that's what they feel they're doing there.
Yeah. And I'd add on to that, Joanna touched on it, a broader management perspective. And today, there is such a war for talent. Well, if you don't get the right people, you're not going to get the best product. And I'd argue that purpose helps you get the best people, that then if you charge more, you're charging more for a better product because you've got the best people around to help develop that business. So I think you can look at purpose not just externally, but what it does to motivate, attract, retain people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's another whole aspect to the pricing thing, which is that it's particularly true if you look at younger people who may not have as much money as some older people. Is that lots of people say they would like be prepared to pay more for a product that from a company that had a purpose, um, or sustainable products, for example. Um, but a lot of people, when it comes to it, affordability trumps purpose. Yeah. So people may not have the money in their budget. It may just be a luxury. So I think that payment for purpose, really much depends upon how big your wallet is.
Yes, and also who your market is. In particular, if you're selling to upper income consumers, the top two or top three quintiles, and especially the top quintile, they are likely to be prepared to spend more. They actually have got the money to spend more as well. Um, the other thing is it's a question of perspective. When we were working, for example, on sustainability in the home building industry, you know, there are issues because you're a more sustainable house is actually more economical to operate over time, but the initial costs are higher. Similar with electric vehicles for that matter. And so it's a question partly of trying to work with people so that they can understand a different perspective. Similarly, when it comes to garments or other things that are made in the developing world, um, there, the actual labor costs, even if you're paying people livable wage, end up being a fairly small proportion of the overall cost of the garment. So there you can actually afford to buy a better garment and to have a cleaner conscience at the same time. And that can become a selling point as well because it's not going to hurt all that much. But all of these things do come into consideration. And one other thing that I was curious was reactions to the generation differences that we saw. Joanna, did you want to comment on the question of Gen Z and how it's responding to purpose?
Well, we have been working actually with Vice Media um, on looking at what creates trust among younger generations. And one of the things that is coming up, this study it's not out yet, but it will be soon, so I can give you a taste, is that, and I think everybody suspects this, but the data show it's actually true because we had 6,000, Gen Zers from all and young millennials from all over the world, and 90% of them say, for me to trust a brand, they need to do what is right, and 85% of them say, for me to trust a brand, it has to fit my values. That is much higher than anything you will find among older generations. So, they feel that they are driven by angst. The world has changed. They're the first, digitally native generation, and the world has changed. And they were around in 2008 and since, but they aren't in power yet. And they feel that all these previous generations have messed the world up, and it's up to them to sort it out. And that's really what lies behind this burden they feel of actually making sure that brands and everybody, governments, institutions, their friends, their families live up to purpose. But they're inherently principled. They believe in doing good, and they feel that they have this need and responsibility to support what's right and brands what's right. It's nothing to do with political affiliation. It cuts across that. It's about, helping other people and society. Brands should help other people and society. It's first and foremost about, environmental. It's about treating people right as an employer. It's about environmental issues, and it's about DEI is really part of the treating people right as an employer or whatever it is. So it's helping other people, environmental issues, social justice, and economic injustice, income equality. So they are driven by purpose. And I think the way that they feel about brands, and with cancel culture, whatever you think about it, forcing everybody to actually act, the world has changed, and it's not going back to just profits. The triple bottom line of people, purpose, people, profits, and purpose is here to stay. Yeah.
Yeah. Although I think one thing one has to say about Gen Z as well is that they face budget constraints. They are the wokest but brokest generation. And we see that very clearly in the results we have on willingness to buy and especially to pay more for product with purpose. Where, as I mentioned, it is the older generations, the millennials and Gen X, who are likelier to do so because they can afford to do so. So that, from a simple marketing issue, is an implication of our findings as well. Sarah, did you want to say anything more on that? Or?
No, I mean, I do think that companies are going to have to rethink much of what they do. And purpose can't be off to the side. It's got to be the integral part of how you operate, because that's what's going to attract people. That's what's going to retain people. That's who's going to buy your products, make your products, develop your products. It's a different world. And I think the new generation represents that different world.
Yeah. I see that Hope, by the way, asked about the question of the relationship between the actual intent, the actual purchase, as opposed to intent to purchase. And she asks, will you be conducting additional research like a second wave to see if and how shifts in purchase intent actually happen? I think it would be a great thing to include in our next wave of research, because this is intended as an ongoing study. We did the first wave in 2019, as I mentioned, and this will hopefully not be the last. And Dorothy Crenshaw has asked, what do you make of the boomers prioritizing voting rights? Any context? Unfortunately, we didn't ask why about that, and that's something we need to look into further. I think there are two pieces. One is that boomers were people who grew up around the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, the era when the struggle for voting was actually quite important. The other, though, is that there are a significant number of boomers who are more conservative, and I wonder if they've also been affected by the various claims that have been made incorrectly that the 2020 election outcome was somehow fixed. So that's something I'd like to get into in our next wave of research as well. And Gary Messina points out voting rights might have different meanings for each group, and I think that's a very good point. We also had a comment from Jonathan as well, which is, I'd love to hear how panelists recommend that purpose is integrated into strategy. Which comes first, That's a question I'm going to toss to Sarah first off, because you were someone who was intimately involved in doing that at J&J.
Yeah, so I think, look, business strategy has to be what is first and foremost. But I do believe that what purpose does is it makes clarity and simplifies your business strategy, and it makes it motivating so that people can rally around it, right? I keep going back to that concept of how do you unite an organization. And I think that you've got to have what you stand for. You then have your business strategy, and then you figure out how all that comes together in a way that makes people want to be a part of it, want to be evangelists for you, want to really be the people that make the company what it's ultimately going to be.
Well, and I would argue that in some cases, purpose actually comes before business strategy and drives business strategy. Because if it answers the question, why we exist and what benefits are we going to bring to the world,
Mhm.
that should dictate what we are trying to achieve by when. And the goal may not be to make money. It might be to have a company that's going to make enough money to do the maximum amount of good and help people in whatever area it's chosen the most. So I don't think it's necessarily true the business strategy comes first, because the business strategy it's operational. Yeah, you have a goal, that's the purpose, and then you have to say how are we going to achieve it. That's the business strategy, and how you implement which also should be driving how you implement the purpose right through the organization, from who you hire to how you're organized, to how you design your products, to how you price them, to how you distribute them, to how you communicate, all those, and what you do, and how you respond to things that happen, which is actually an important part of it.
Yeah. No, if anyone has had the chance to read or the book or read excerpts from it, but Pfizer's CEO just finished a book called Moonshot that talked about purpose and how purpose drove the pandemic response, both the vaccines as well as the treatments that Pfizer developed. And I think he echoes beautifully that he knew what he wanted to accomplish because of his purpose, and he aligned his organization to it. And when the need came, that organization responded driven by its purpose in everything from developing the products to manufacturing to pricing to bringing them to the marketplace. And it's, I think, one of the best demonstrations of true purpose driving business.
Yeah, I would also add that in order to respond effectively, you also need to know what it is your consumers or customers want. Because as we saw, there are some significant differences by generation, differences by income level, differences by a racial or ethnic background, and the like. So one of the things that's important is not just to look at this as a generic issue. Oh, well, we need to be good corporate citizens. We need to be good this or that. But actually to see what is it that your people themselves want. I mean, a very interesting example of this was Colin Kaepernick and Nike, when initially the reactions were that Nike's support of Kaepernick was going to cost it. There were highly publicized criticisms and even the burnings of some sneakers. But when the firm discovered that it had made the right move, because in fact, with the customers that it had, particularly Black urban youth, sales went up and overall sales went up significantly. So it is a question also of like KYC, but really know your customer. Oh, Kathy Hall asked us to repeat the name of the Pfizer book. I think it's Moonshot, isn't it, Sarah?
Yes, correct, Craig. Yes.
Okay. And I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about implementing brand purpose across an organization? You've had the most experience of the three of us on that because you were on the inside. So
Right.
without revealing any confidential information, can you give us a sense of what that actually means or what that actually meant?
Yeah, it started with something really very basic. It started with understanding that as someone responsible for the corporate brand, I had to think of my role really differently. And it wasn't simply a storytelling role, it was really a strategy role. And it was a role that would help to set the organization strategy to which many other components would follow. So that was really a shift, and it required recognizing the power of the corporate brand, bringing the data forward that demonstrated the power of a brand, the power of a reputation, the power of our individual brand, where it was meeting stakeholder expectations, where it wasn't, and then driving forward to form that brand purpose in a very integrated fashion across the company. And then taking a lot of steps to reach out to different partners. We put together brand partnerships across the corporation that had never been done before. In a decentralized company like Johnson and Johnson, the pharmaceutical and consumer brand business never worked together. Well, we developed ways that they could, where the corporate brand was the hero, but each brand could win underneath it. But it was deeper than that. Partnerships with DE&I, and we're doing this back in 2016, 2017. And I will tell you, it was powerful because when the DE&I folks could think through the lens of changing the trajectory of health for humanity in DE&I, they had different strategies, they had different approaches. We did the same thing with corporate citizenship, same thing with our environmental sustainability area. And when those folks think through the power of purpose, they think both how they can do their jobs differently and how they can come together.
Yeah.
So I think that was kind of my initial take of just thinking differently, working in different ways. I'll also add that one of the most important partnerships internally was the human resource one. And that was for a really simple reason. It's everything we've been saying. Your human resource policies have to match what you're trying to achieve, and hence the reason for that really close partnership.
Yes, I think that one of the things that really stands out for me from that description is the fact that when we're talking about a firm adopting or responding to purpose, it's not just a marketing strategy, it's really an exercise in organizational change.
Exactly. Exactly. And I would caution everybody, in many ways, I think the hardest part was the organizational change because it required so much deep integration across all functions and all levels of the organization. And one of my favorite stories, and Joanne will appreciate this, was trying to talk to a group of CFOs about the power of purpose. And there were a couple of key data points that made them believe it was real. And eventually over time, as we looked at the valuation of the company, the brand and reputation became part of that. And that's when you really know that you broke through because it's part of how the company looks at itself.
And that's so important. There's a question that I'll bring up because nobody has, which is this whole idea of purpose greenwashing. So purpose is fashionable. Everybody has to have a purpose. And in some cases, it's just putting lipstick on a pig. And you have to live your purpose, not driving it through your employees, and having people who really embrace the purpose is the first step. But the key thing is don't just talk, take action. If you do not live up to your purpose in everything you do as a brand, you will lose the trust. The purpose will cease to have any effect. It doesn't mean that every company is perfect and will always act right. Everybody makes mistakes, but if you own up, not just own up when you make mistakes, but take action. I mean, maybe firing somebody, but hopefully it's about changing the organization so that whatever went wrong doesn't happen again. It's about what Nike did, as you were saying, which is it's taking a stance, taking risks, not being afraid to live up to your purpose and put money behind it. What people actually believe is companies don't just say we've got a purpose, but people who support, things that fit with what they believe in and their purpose, and support them financially, and with with things that they do with their products. For example, if you look at Louis Vuitton, one of the world's best brands, when the pandemic started, what did they do? They transformed their perfume factories, which by the way are set up to kind of in the right way, into making hand sanitizers. So you could have a Louis Vuitton, we might have known it, but you had a Louis Vuitton hand sanitizer to help stop the spread of COVID. That is actually acting with your purpose. It's doing something concrete. So it's no good just having a purpose. Don't dress up in a purpose. You've got to believe in it, do it, and inform every aspect of the organization.
Yes, and it also does have to be authentic as well. I mean, if you spend a century selling highly addictive products to people and suddenly announce that you are a harm reduction organization, for example, and expect many people to believe you. But you know, the notion of authenticity, the notion that you are doing something that is brave or at least consistent with what you say you are trying to do, with what your product is or what your goals are, is something that makes a great deal of difference as well to the credibility of purpose.
Well, there's one quick thing I'd like to add on to this voting rights question, which I thought was very interesting, this democracy thing, which is, I think that the reason why it's less relevant to the younger generations is, well, first of all, you look at Gen Z, half of them are still at school, they can't vote. Yeah. So it's not such an issue. Half of it that the whole political arena has lost trust among younger generations,
Yeah.
and that therefore they think that it's action. It's more them taking to the streets or taking action or social media talking about what needs to happen that makes it. It's a loss of trust in political institutions, and it's being overwhelmed by the importance of, you know, the need for environmental sustainability and social justice that they see as so much more important.
I think those are all good points. And of course, historically, younger people have tended to be less politically involved. They vote less, and the like, whereas people who are at later stages of their life, especially 50 plus, tend to vote a lot more too. So that also may be a factor that's involved. Yeah, we're almost at the end. So let me just ask if anyone has any last urgent questions, please type them in the chat. Otherwise, let's see if there are any final comments. Sarah, would you have any last?
Yeah, I hope that you take away the authenticity point, because I do believe that that's one of the most important ones. And I think authenticity leads to the word experience for me. And what I mean by that is, we today as marketers think of digital experiences, et cetera. And yes, yes, yes. But the most important thing is that every experience that a stakeholder has with the company has to reflect its brand purpose. That's its people, that's its digital interactions, that's everything. So I think when I think of purpose, I think of experience very close to it. And I would ask everyone to perhaps think about that as a takeaway.
Okay. And Joanna, any concluding thoughts?
Oh, a quick takeaway is going right back to the beginning when I was talking about P&G, is that having a brand purpose, companies that have a purpose and live it and don't just talk but act, actually make more money. So it is the future of capitalism.
Okay, and then to conclude, let me just once again share the screen where you can actually download the report. As I mentioned, if you don't want to copy all that down, you can just go to the AMA New York webpage. Let me thank you all for attending this, and obviously, Joanna, Sarah, I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. You can reach us through LinkedIn. There'll be another installment coming as well, which is the B2B installment of Future Marketing. So keep your eyes open for that if you like this one. And we look forward to speaking with you then. In the meantime, then, thank you all for participating, and thank you all for attending today.
Great.
Okay, we'll now terminate the webinar.